Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are very excited about this symposium and we're very excited to have you with us today. We will be starting very soon. Again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today in the first part of our four-part symposium entitled Unequal Englishes, Unequal Speakers. A special welcome goes to the symposium co-conveners, Dr. Rouhani Toupas, who teaches at the Department of Culture, Communication and Media, Institute of Education, University College London. He's an associate editor of the International Journal of the Sociology of Language. Professor Sarah Stewart, who is the Director of Academic Affairs at the Hartford campus and Director of Global Education at the NIAG School of Education at the University of Connecticut. And Dr. Myra Garces-Baxal, who serves as the Assistant Dean for Research and Graduate Studies for the College of Education, UAE University. She is also an Associate Professor in the Special Education Department. Today's session is entitled Gender, Class, and Unequal Englishes. I am Fajr, and along with my colleague, Najla Al-Awais, we will be your host for this session. There will be a 5 to 10 minute Q&A session after each presentation, so please make sure to write your questions in the chat box. We will make sure to attend to as many questions as we can within the allowed time frame. Najla and I would like to remind you to please follow the ethical code of conduct in this virtual space and to please keep your comments respectful. Also, please feel free to reach out to us in the chat box in case of technical issues. The organizing committee will be happy to help you with that. Finally, there will be special announcements about the attendance certificates and the feedback form toward the end of the session. Please stay tuned for that as we have two presentations lined up for today. Without further ado, Professor Lo Yiling has sent her welcoming remarks in a video. Professor Lo Yiling is the Dean of Academic and Faculty Affairs at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and is a series editor in Routledge Studies in World Englishes. Let us take a few minutes to listen to her remarks.
Warmest greetings from Singapore, and from whichever part of the world you are, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I would like to thank the organizers of this symposium on unequal Englishes, namely Dr. Rouhani Toupas from University College London, based in the United Kingdom, for inviting me to talk about the Routledge Studies in World Englishes series. My name is Professor Lo Yiling, and I'm the series editor for the Routledge Studies in World Englishes, of which Dr. Rouhani's volume will be appearing as one of the books within the series. I would like to talk a little bit about the context of the series. When it was conceptualized in 2015, we found that World Englishes is one of the fastest developing areas of linguistic research. And there are also increasing research scholarship and publications in this field. There is a need urgently for us to update this field due to the burgeoning development in the field and also growing demands in the field. And there were many research and scholarship gaps to fill. Hence, we conceptualized this Routledge series in World Englishes for those who are interested in the following areas: the spread of English around the world in the current globalized context of English usage. Secondly, issues and theoretical paradigms, including features-based studies of all varieties of English around the world. And finally, language in use. By this, we mean language in use in different domains in education, media, law, and other related disciplines. The aims of the series are to add to existing scholarship and also endeavor to break new ground in the field. Secondly, to provide rigorous features-based studies of all varieties of world Englishes. Thirdly, investigate issues and theoretical paradigms surrounding the conceptualization and scholarship on world Englishes. Fifthly, to explore new varieties of English around the world. And finally, to provide an up-to-date state-of-the-art documentation of the field of world Englishes. I would like to talk to you about some of the titles that have already appeared in the so far 21 titles in the series. A very recent published title would be English in East and South Asia, Policy, Features, and Language in Use, co-edited by Eling Low and Anne Pakir. Also in 2021, we have The Nominal Pluralization and Countability in African Varieties of English by Suzanne Moore. Next, we also had in 2022, English in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, The Transformation of Language Habitats, published by Azira Hashim and Gerhard Leitner. In 2022, we have this forthcoming title that has just been published by Xu Zhichang on Chinese English, Names, Norms, and Narratives. Likewise, Ariane Bologan's co-edited book on Philippine English, Development, Structure, and Sociology of English in the Philippines has just been published. And finally, English in China, Language, Identity, and Culture is forthcoming by Emily Si Yen Fong. These are the many authors of the series that you can read on your own. We are seeking proposals in the following areas: English in Europe or European Englishes, English in Great Britain and the British Isles or English in the UK, English in the United States of America and Latin America for that matter, English in the Arab world. If you have a proposal on any one of these areas, please do not hesitate to submit your book proposal to eling.low@nie.edu.sg. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you very much for your kind attention. And for more information on the book series, please scan the QR code that you see on the screen. Have a very successful symposium ahead.
Thank you, Professor Ling, for your kind remarks. I would like to mention that the Provost of the United Arab Emirates University, Professor Matthew Richard Evans, sends his apologies for not being able to join us today. He really wanted to be here to welcome everyone. Without further ado, it's time for our presentation now. Presentation 1 is entitled Gender, Caste, and Class, Navigating the Political Economy of English in India by Dr. Katie Hyatt from the University of the West of Scotland. The presentation will be moderated by Professor Saran Stewart. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hyatt, who is a lecturer in English language and TESOL at the University of the West of Scotland. She was previously an Economic and Social Research Council postdoctoral fellow at UCL Institute of Education, where she also earned her PhD in sociolinguistics. Dr. Hyatt, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully that should work. Okay. Is my screen okay? Everyone can see that?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, I'd just like to begin by saying thank you so much to all of the organisers for the invitation. It really is a pleasure to be speaking here today, and I'm really looking forward to the whole series of presentations and discussions ahead. So what I'll be talking about today emerges from a wider question about how English gets discursively linked to social mobility and how this is negotiated by students from marginalised backgrounds who turn towards English in the hopes of securing a more stable future for themselves. As I hope to make clear, I believe that these questions are best approached through a political economic lens, one which takes into account, in Flubacher et al.'s terms, how individuals are embedded in specific socio-political, economic, and institutional structures. Grounded in this perspective, there are two things that I would like to explore today. The first is how the coloniality, class, caste, capitalism nexus has consequences on how marginalized young adults orient themselves to constructed notions of correctness and reify language boundaries as they seek and hope for social mobility through English. Building on this, in the second part, I want to raise questions about the nature of this ostensible English capital and the convertibility of their newfound English speakerhood, with an emphasis on how this is further complicated through conflicting and contradictory gendered norms. Before we get to that, let me introduce the NGO where I carried out the ethnographic fieldwork that I'll be presenting today. A non-profit institution headed by an Indian expat living in the USA, the NGO provides free English and employability training to anyone over the age of 15. The year-long program aims to develop students' English language skills, as well as providing training in what they call personality development, along with careers counselling, lifelong learning, and other soft skills. With over 100 branches and counting across North India, the organization was founded as a means to alleviate poverty in Delhi and its surrounding areas and help students on the path to professional jobs. As the program is entirely free of cost with minimal eligibility requirements, it attracts quite a range of students, both women and men, from students in their final year of school to housewives and parents. Most students have been educated in Hindi medium government or state schools, and otherwise would not have been able to afford the similar types of training that are offered by costly coaching institutes and private language schools. Most of the students I met, including Arnav, who I'll introduce in the next section, came from one particular agrarian caste group, which has been allocated other backward class or OBC status by the government, as it is deemed to be, and I'm quoting here, socially and educationally backward. This is a caste group which, as we will see, has a certain degree of stigma, aptly described by one of my students who told me how his peers at university, they think our caste is backward, they think cheap, they don't know how we can speak English, how can we survive, or how can we be educated, like not gentlemen. While the students often came from quite different backgrounds, there was nonetheless a general shared belief that English would be their ticket to stability, security, and prestige. Conversely, English incompetence was framed as, and I'm quoting Lavanya Morali-Proctor here, the only thing holding people back from enjoying the benefits of globalization, upward mobility, better jobs, social betterment, and movement into a better culture. The problem of social inequality thus centers around the question of access to English, and in this way appears to be, in Proctor's terms, ostensibly easily rectified through access to English language training, which allegedly can provide the economic, cultural, and symbolic capital necessary for social mobility or success. As one young man in the NGO told me, English is my key. Now, this discourse is precisely the one that I hope to interrogate today through the experiences of two members of the NGO whose stories shed light on the complexities of English inequality and social mobility in India. We'll start with Arnav. Arnav was 17 years old when I met him, and he belonged to the same agrarian caste that I mentioned before. He was a particularly diligent student and often came to the center hours before class to read books or use the computers. At the end of a teaching session one morning, I had noticed Arnav looking rather frustrated as his classmate told him that she'd heard him using Hindi words during their class discussion, which Arnav vehemently denied. Although language fluidity is hardly unusual in India, Arnav's reactions suggested a certain level of frustration at what he appeared to interpret as an accusation, a suggestion that he was incapable of appropriately managing his language repertoire. In my conversations with Arnav about this incident, it became clear that Arnav's reluctance to engage in fluid practices and his anxious desire to remain within constructed boundaries of English stemmed from his awareness of how his practices were differently evaluated across different interactional contexts. This didn't mean that he consistently adhered to language boundaries. In fact, his linguistic deftness, which he described as mixing Hindi and English, was something that he both enjoyed and took pride in when in the presence of friends or family whose competency in English was not as strong as his, as they think that I know English and they talk to me very politely or they give me respect. In this context, Arnav's ability to draw on English marks him as a competent speaker, which in turn works as a form of symbolic capital, indexing education, intelligence, and status. But he was also aware of the limits to the positive uptake of such fluid practices, and he reportedly monitored his speech more carefully when around people that he knew or assumed to be English speakers, regardless of whether these people themselves engaged in fluid practices or not, for fear of them interpreting his fluidity as incompetency, himself as not properly educated. As work on ratiolinguistic ideologies suggests, Arnav's self-monitoring emerges from a recognition that rather than being framed as sociolinguistic deftness, skill, and futuristic dynamism, his practices often become evidence of deficit, confusion, and inadequate past language learning. Here, however, while racialization certainly shapes Arnav's relationship of legitimacy with the language, it is less salient in Arnav's narrative as the imagined interlocutors are similarly racialized as Indian. What emerges more markedly here is how Arnav and his imagined interlocutors are differently positioned through class and caste stratification, and how Arnav's fluid practices may serve to reinforce the stigmatization already in place of his caste group. Unlike for Bollywood actors or other such cultural elites who tend to engage in such celebrated fluidity with uninhibited ease, or in high-end advertising, which exploits language fluidity to target the upper and elite classes, Arnav's social interactions appear to have taught him that his practices will be heard and evaluated differently, potentially even mocked, particularly, he suggests, by those located in positions of social and economic power. Now, it's not my intention here to suggest that race and caste can or should be conflated, but there are useful parallels that can be drawn between racialized and caste and class deficit ideologies through which speakers' practices are interpreted, regardless of, in Flora's and Rosa's terms, the objective characteristics of their language use. In addition to what Flores and Rosa call the white listening subject, here we are confronted with the figure of the upper class, upper caste listening subject, a figure infused with its own complex colonial histories of alignment with whiteness. Arnav appears to have sensed this himself, and he adapts his language practices to mitigate potential social and material risks. While this shapes how Arnav pursues and engages in English more generally, it is particularly heightened when he is in contact with those who, through their racialized class and caste positions, myself included, have been granted discursive legitimacy as speakers of English. So through the further layers of stratifying effects, both material and discursive, of class and caste, the pursuit of good English interpolates even more deeply the bodies and minds of marginalized students and keeps them in a perpetual, never-ending loop of self-improvement. So what we've seen through Arnab's story is how students' pursuit of good English is driven by a narrative of correct English being the gateway to a bright future and transformed self, which will allow them to reap the benefits of modernity and globalization. In this second section, I want to speak back to this discourse by showing how the shaky ground on which it is built starts to crumble as it gets articulated alongside other conflicting ideological regimes linked to diverging and competing political economic interests. This, as we will see, re-signifies English learning as a risk, particularly for young women. When I met Rupal, a facilitator at the NGO, she was a young unmarried woman in her early 20s. She had completed her education in Hindi medium in a government school and had previously been a student at the same NGO before undergoing training to become a facilitator a couple of years before I met her. Rupal was in many ways the poster child for the NGO. Although she was from the Brahmin caste, the highest caste, she had grown up in poverty with her parents working as laborers until her older sisters were old enough to find work and contribute to the family income. She's the only one of her sisters to have completed school and to have gone to university. And she's also the only member of her family who speaks English. Rupal was understandably very proud of doing the impossible, of becoming an English speaker despite the odds, of creating for herself a promising future that she believed to be impossible without this language. In addition to the promises of social mobility that are more generally discursively linked to English in India, for women, English ostensibly offers various promises in addition to employment. Firstly, through its ideological alignment with liberalism and modernity, it offers progressiveness and empowerment. Secondly, it holds the potential for aspirational upward marriages. As Priti Sandhu has shown, English medium brides are often perceived as economically a better prospect, which further exacerbates, and I'm quoting here, the subordination already operational in the patriarchally constrained lives of Hindi medium educated women. Approaching her mid-20s, Rupal and her family were beginning to search for a potential husband, and she knew that her English capital could be deployed to negotiate a better husband. She explained how her parents had recently refused an offer of marriage on her behalf because the male suitor did not speak English. She told me, he didn't know English and he was just 12 pass and I knew English and I was graduated, but he was at the same age of mine. So when they asked, my father told, no, my daughter is an English teacher. So they denied by themselves. Rupal's status as an English teacher accorded her a certain leverage that her sister, for example, was not able to draw on in her own marital negotiations, despite being from the same family. But shortly after telling me this, Rupal indicated that her English capital became unstable in interaction with particular ideologies of gender. She described to me the reaction of another man's parents who did not agree to her marriage with their son precisely because she speaks English. They said, no, she's so educated, our son will be under her only because she knows English and she's educated. So she will control my son, she will not allow him to do anything else. She will order. Here, Rupal's English capital loses its leverage. Now, this doesn't mean that speaking English has no value in this space. Quite the opposite. Superiority is granted to Rupal as an English speaker through the process of fractal recursivity, by which the indexical relationship of English-speaking classes and superiority at a national level is reproduced and repeated, positioning her as superior within her particular social class. This poses a threat to her non-English speaking suitor, the threat of him losing face if his wife has the upper hand. Through the indexical associations of English speakers as modern and highly educated, Rupal is positioned as a woman who may refuse to follow patriarchal norms and therefore as a potentially controlling or unsubmissive wife. This rejection reflects how, for some, English is not a celebrated torchbearer of progress, but rather, as Kira Hall writes, a carrier of moral decay that poses a threat to tradition, and here most explicitly to traditional expectations of womanhood and wifehood. But importantly, The traditional expectations of womanhood and wifehood evoked here are deeply embedded in RuPaul's caste position. As mentioned, RuPaul belongs to the highest caste, the Brahmins, for whom the policing of women's virtue and chastity has historically been heightened in order to ensure their endogamous reproduction and therefore purity. This policing extends to a wide range of practices, from vegetarianism and menstruation taboos to moral values and social interactions. A Brahmin woman is traditionally expected to be demure and chaste, and anything that may index a deviation from this, such as an alignment with English, is potentially threatening. In RuPaul's own family, she acknowledges how her parents have allowed her more interactional freedom than her sisters. She described how, had she not joined the NGO and pursued English, her life may have been very different because, and I'm quoting RuPaul here, my parents also didn't allow earlier, like my sisters, they never went out. I'm the only girl who came out, who is talking to boys like this, who is teaching. In RuPaul's understanding, her pursuit of English, and through this, a bright future, is what has allowed her parents to justify their relaxation of behavioral expectations by letting RuPaul interact with men outside of the home. It's nevertheless risky though, because the acquisition of English and how she mobilizes this for economic gain sit uncomfortably alongside certain valued aspects of Brahminical womanhood and wifehood that RuPaul may be expected to adhere to by the family of her future husband. The point here is certainly not to imply that Brahmin women bear the brunt of misogyny in India. As many have shown, poor Dalit women occupy the most acutely abused and disenfranchised positions in Indian society. But rather, what I seek to highlight here is how RuPaul's English capital fluctuates through its inter-animation, in Christian Chun's terms, with discourses of womanhood. These discourses are, in turn, indissociable from both her class and caste positions, as she seeks to reinforce her middle-class aspirations through the acquisition of English. But in doing so, she must monitor her adherence to norms of Brahminical middle-class femininity in order to mobilize her caste capital. So the pursuit of English contains certain risks that can only be understood when we shift the focus away from decontextualized questions of unequal Englishes and towards questions of the social positioning of speakers. RuPaul's English capital is not only speculative, but it's also fluctuating. It gains and loses value across time and space as it intersects and clashes with other discourses, particularly here, patriarchal discourses of what constitutes a good wife. Much like in the case of Arabic in Hassima and Garrido's study, the indexicalities attributed to English and English speakers, I quote, encompass cultural and professional values with both positive and negative symbolic and material consequences that go beyond straightforward capital conversion. And so we see the ostensibly straightforward discursive construction of English as capital unravel as its speakers, with their various social positionings and life trajectories, attempt to put it into practice and are forced to negotiate its shifting value, its enabling and hindering potential. So RuPaul has quite the balancing act on her hands. When I left the NGO, she was undertaking a teaching degree, and she was hoping to complete this before her parents found her a suitable husband. She knew that they respected her wishes and that she would have the final say, but she was glad that their attention was focused for the moment on her older unmarried sister, for whom finding a husband was a bigger priority. RuPaul was unsure of what her future had in store, but was nonetheless adamant that her training and experience would allow her to retain some financial independence. Worried that her future in-laws would object to her continuing to work full-time, she had prepared several contingency plans, such as offering home tuition. In doing so, RuPaul demonstrated a keen awareness of the contradictory nature of the multiple logics at play. In particular, how neoliberal discourses of freedom and liberation through English clashed with her lived experience, and she tempers her hope in ways that allow her to exercise agency within the confines of a patriarchal colonial system. To very briefly conclude, What I hope to have highlighted today is what is erased when issues of social inequality are resignified as issues caused by and resolved through access to language. Unequal access to English is certainly a pressing issue in India and elsewhere. But attempts to provide marginalized students with English as a means to alleviate poverty or encourage social mobility misdiagnose the root cause of the problem and offer instead language solutions funneled through a neoliberal ideology and built upon sedimented layers of coloniality, caste and class stratification, and patriarchy that intersect, interanimate in complex ways, and that can only be apprehended when we take as our point of analysis not just unequal Englishes, but unequal speakers in unequal conditions. Thank you very much. I have my references that I'm willing to share with anyone afterwards, or there's more for more information on the project. There are some links on this slide too. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hyatt. That was brilliant. We do have about 10 minutes for questions. Well, I think we have about 12 minutes for questions. So I will open up with a couple of remarks regarding your presentation, and then I've already kind of sent you a couple of questions. So I'll be selective, and those in the audience that wants to pose questions, please go ahead and do so. And I'll try my best to pick up as many questions as possible in this time that we have. Brilliant remarks. I am struck by the use of a couple of thematic points that are coming through in the very two different kind of participants that you selected for this particular presentation. One that's overarching is a sense of whiteness as power and English as a parallel to whiteness, right? And that becomes a part of capital and currency. And what I'm thinking through as well is how the notion of Dr. Tara Yasso's work in cultural wealth capital in particular is coming through, and she talks about linguistic capital. So when you talk about English as capital, how that's being navigated within the familial structures, and then how you problematize it around patriarchal heteronormativity, and how that plays such a strong role in neo-colonial systems such as those within India, right? Highly complex, which we're going to, some of the questions are going to ask you to really break those down and how they're implicated for educators. But before we get there, I think what's fascinating, and I would love to hear more on, are these parallels that are drawn. And I think RuPaul's case really complicates it. RuPaul is both where race and caste, similar to Arnav's case, can't be used as proxies, which you didn't make a note, but you were trying to use them in terms of parallels. RuPaul kind of really disrupts that, right? And I do wonder if that's disrupted in particular because of her gender, and how the gender connotation, especially in a system, a cis-patriarchal system such as that, really plays a role that disrupts caste and race and class altogether. And those intersections are very difficult to be unlocked at their various points of oppression. So really fascinating work, and I'm excited to read just more on that project. So the first question I want to ask you is to draw out some of the implications for the teachers in the space, the educational professors in the space, and the school leaders in the space. And so that's the first one. And then I'll ask one other before I open it out to the audience questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those comments. I really appreciate that. And I think, this is the question that I've really struggled with this question. Anybody who knows me knows exactly how much I've struggled with this question in terms of what are the practical implications for this. I think, I opted for a critical approach to the analysis that I did with this research, and that implies a certain level of tension when you take those questions or you take those results back to the teachers, the organization that you're dealing with. And so on the one hand, I have been critical of their practices. I've been critical of the narratives that are peddled within the NGO, how inequality tends to get glossed over, it gets erased. As you mentioned, this idea of linguistic capital, but as soon as we interrogate that, it really falls apart. As soon as we start pulling on these threads of whiteness, of race, of capitalism. So a logical conclusion of that would be, well, maybe the NGO shouldn't exist. But at the same time, that's clearly not what I believe. I don't believe that the NGO should close its doors, because at the end of the day, it really does make a difference to, hundreds, and well, they have hundreds of thousands of people enrolled, right? In loads of branches. So I think probably what I would suggest, or the implications would be for us to think a bit more carefully about the extent to which we can change things in the classroom. And I think perhaps just a more critical acknowledgement, and perhaps a less naive or less superficial acknowledgement of precisely what can get changed in the classroom. Because, I think critical pedagogy, I think all of these innovative ways, encouraging our learners or our students to become more critical about their practices, I think are absolutely brilliant. But at the same time, what I'm trying to show through my research is the classroom is not only located within these structures, but also reproduces these structures. And the classroom also needs to be interrogated. And so to that extent, I think, pedagogical innovation is extremely important, but it's going to take a huge amount more if we are to actually start breaking down the structures that lead students like Arnav or people like Rupal to have actually gone to this NGO in the first place. So, I don't mean that in a kind of let's all be hopeless about this way, but maybe be realistic about what we can do in the classroom and think about how we can be fighting the fight elsewhere too.
I love that. Thank you so much. The other question I had was, connected to the inequities that were mentioned, especially as you're absolutely right. I love the slide, the simplicity, but the messaging that was the strike through around language solutions. Right? I thought it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So the question is, does learning English widen and or deepen inequities at the intersections of class, caste, and gender?
Yeah, I think this is a tough one. There is an issue with students in India not having access to English. And as the current status quo goes, if you don't have access to English, your life chances are going to be reduced. Obviously, that's a bit of a generalization, but at the end of the day, these students, they are going to have a more stable life outcome afterwards. They're going to be able to get the type of jobs that, for example, give them health benefits or give them a pension. And I really don't think we should underestimate the importance of that for somebody who otherwise would have been headed for a life of real financial insecurity. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think it's just the teaching of English that widens inequalities. It's how the teaching of English is framed. So I think when the teaching of English is framed as something that is, once it's offered to everyone, then everyone's on an equal footing. Or as, to go back to my final slide, once English is implemented or is described or narrativized as this solution, it completely glosses over everything that is hidden, everything that was a reason why people come to English in the first place. So I think it's less about, or at least what interests me, is less about the extent to which English causes or deepens these inequalities, and more about how the discourse of English itself hides or completely masks all of the parts of the social structure that we then stop talking about. We look at English and it becomes a conversation of, we need to give more English to these students. We need to give them more skills, rather than why is it that these students were being funneled into certain types of education as it was to begin with? How did these structures even come to be there in the first place? And that for me is where the question we would be better off asking.
And then one of my final questions, as I'm waiting for others, is I'm going to complicate this one a little bit for you, because you already did that in your narrative. You said myself included. I'm going to go and stretch it just a little bit and talk just about your positionality. Mm-hmm. You mentioned about English as capital. You mentioned it within the space of power, and then whiteness, and then labeled within yourself. So to agitate this question is, how do you think within talking about these various intersections of class, caste, and race within India, how you yourself are positioned as a researcher in this space, in this NGO, how that complicates you coming to know this work, do this work? I'm so intrigued by your positionality in framing this, and then framing that of within the write-up and the analysis of this work as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, this was something that was right at the forefront of my thinking right from the beginning. You know, I'm a white British woman doing research in India. You know, there is already immediately there are dynamics that need to be addressed, need to be considered, and so that was a key part of how I understood my role there. I mean, how I came to do this, I was already I'd worked in India previously for about 5 years, where I was teaching languages, and so I had quite a deep knowledge of the political situation around English. But it's interesting how I actually came to the NGO, and this really speaks to these kind of more global systems. I mean, when I was writing my thesis, where I was dealing with a lot of this data, I mentioned that serendipitously, this NGO kind of fell into my lap, in that somebody who worked for the NGO contacted my supervisor at the time and said to him, "We're looking to work with academics. Are you interested?" He said, "Isn't that incredible? I have a student who is just about to start her PhD and she wants to do research on India. This would be a great collaboration." But the more I thought about it, the less serendipitous I realized it was. You know, I mean, it was serendipitous in the sense that, you know, it happened by chance. But then, how much of it really was chance, right? I mean, I was at UCL. I was at a university in London. This is an institution in India who are attempting to build their reputation, build their global status by aligning themselves with institutions in the Western world. So the fact that it was my supervisor who got contacted at this particular institution, the fact that I had even been to India in the first place, aged 21, with very little qualifications, you know, all of these different trajectories that led to that particular instant, you know, me being in that space, were lucky to a certain extent, but also had so much to do with who I was and how I had been able to move through the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we do have a couple of questions by the audience. I'm going to move straight to those.
Sure.
So the first one is, there may be hundreds, thousands enrolled, but what becomes of students after the course or program has been completed? Is there any follow-up? How or to what extent are the students' lives have been improved? Do you know that?
So I've kept in touch with a few of the students. The biggest issue is that when a year after I left the field, the pandemic happened, and so I think a lot of plans that the students might have had became really derailed through the pandemic. The NGO is running randomized controlled trials where they are trying to assess, in terms of money, how much students from the NGO are earning once they graduate from the program compared to their peers. And from the results that they have so far, it looks like they double their salary. And clearly this is important research that needs to be done. And I do think that's important. But my issue with that line of thinking is that it completely ignores all of these other aspects that I'm trying to pinpoint. So people like Rupal, for example, or some of the young women that I met at the NGO, a lot of them, quite a few of the young women dropped out partway through the course because they got married or because of family requirements, family demands. Others, they just enrolled in another course. So they would enroll in a computing course, and then that would finish and there would still not really be many opportunities. And so they would enroll in, I don't know, like a salon training course. And a few of the students I'm in touch with, they do seem to be trapped in this perpetual loop of skill building, right? Which is part of the neoliberalization, not only of India, but of education more widely. And this idea that these students need to be continually, incessantly adding skills to their repertoire in order for them to find a job, which I think puts the emphasis on the student and not on, well, why are these structures so unfairly allocated in the first place?
Brilliant. Dr. Hyatt, I could speak to you all day and there's tons of
I'd love
questions for you,
to.
but we have a second speaker. So what we
Sure.
are actually going to do is make sure that you can address the questions within the chat. There's roughly around 6 other questions that have come in that period of time. And so those will be sent to you in the chat so that as we're preparing and listening to our other speaker, you can also respond to those so we can learn some more about this incredible study. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks.
All right. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Hyatt, for your insightful talk, and to Dr. Saran for your moderation. Coming next is presentation 2, entitled Intersecting Inequalities, Unequal Englishes, Language, Gender, and Class in the Philippine Call Centers by Dr. Eileen Solonga from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. The presentation will be moderated by Dr. Myra Garces Paxal. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eileen Solonga, who is a professor at the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. She has a PhD in English Language Studies from the National University of Singapore and an MA in English from Virginia Tech. Dr. Solonga, the mic is yours.
Hello, good evening from Manila. So before I begin, I would like to thank the organizers, okay, the conveners of this symposium for inviting me to be part of this really wonderful series of talks. So, okay, let me now share my screen. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Intersecting Inequalities, Unequal Englishes, Language, Gender, and Class in Philippine Call Centers. So this presentation, okay, is really an investigation of the intersection between language, gender, and class as they play out in the linguistic practice and performance of call center workers in the Philippines. So I have 2 analytical points, okay, in my presentation. First is that gender remains a salient category in the linguistic production of the call center workers in the study. And this is similar to the claims in earlier call center research emphasizing call center work as feminized work. Okay. However, the feminization of call center work in the Philippines takes a different, more complex turn. So, okay. The next point is that class also figures prominently in the worker's ability to deliver the required linguistic performance. This is a discussion that is absent in earlier call center studies, but which is now significant in offshore call center research precisely because of the required use of English in the Philippine call center workplace. So mainly I will be using the Unequal Englishes framework, okay, to make sense, okay, of the relationships, okay, between the social categories I mentioned, because it offers a critical lens with which to understand, okay, the intersection of gender and class in the linguistic production of Filipino call center workers and the inequalities that are embedded in the preferred or desired linguistic performance. Unequal Englishes also provides for and will be enriched by a truly intersectional analysis that locates inequalities within and across different Englishes, vis-a-vis within and across the different social categories occupied by different deposition speakers. So when I go to my analysis later, I will explain these things further. Okay, so for the data, I am mainly using interviews with 20 call center workers from different call centers in the Philippines that I conducted from 2007 to 2008. Okay, this is actually part of a bigger study, and there have been additional interviews over the years, okay, but this will still be the main focus. I'm also following 2 big academic conversations here, and these are first the research, okay, on early call centers. These are the call centers located in the UK and in the US. Okay, and so the different strands in these conversations include the political economy of the gender division of labor, and also the feminine and masculine representations of work in the new global economy. There's also language and gender research on the differences between so-called feminine and masculine ways of talking. And finally, there's this whole talk about the call center regime and its feminization, okay, in terms of the actual numbers, okay, of workers, male and female workers, in terms of representation, and then in terms of speech style as well.
Dr. Eileen, sorry. Yeah, apologies for interrupting. I think the slides are not moving. So we are just, we are just in the first slide at the moment.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
That's all right. So
It's
sorry
for me. I don't know. Do I stop sharing and then share again?
Yes, maybe you can try that. I think you could also move like the arrow somewhere there at the bottom part of your screen, because right now it's just 1 out of 41.
Yeah. So what are you seeing now? Is it the title slide?
Yes, just the title slide. That's
how
it.
about, okay. And then next, is it moving now?
Not yet. It's still not moving. Yeah, so it's still 1 out of 41 that we can see.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah,
I'm so sorry about that. I will stop sharing and then I'll just share again. Okay. I don't know what's wrong. Because earlier it was working, right?
Yes, yes, it was. So let's try again.
Okay. Is it moving now?
Now it's a white screen that we see.
Oh no. Let me, okay. Just give me a few seconds to fix this. I don't know what I did wrong, but anyway.
That's all right. Yeah. So technical glitches are inevitable.
Yeah. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. That's okay.
Okay. Let me check again. Okay. Okay. So that's the title slide.
There you go. Now it's moving.
Is it moving?
Yes, it's moving now.
Okay, so all right. Let me then go to, is it page 3?
It's still I think page 1 at the moment.
Can I wait? I will ask for help.
Sure. So perhaps while we wait for Dr. Eileen to figure out the Canva style of presentation, maybe Dr. Hyatt can answer one of the questions, one of the burning questions that are now in the Q&A. Katie, you're still with us?
So sure, maybe, yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah, maybe you could choose from one of these really fascinating questions that they have here.
Yeah, I was just going through them actually. Thank you to everyone who's posted a question. A lot of them have got me thinking. There was a question from Martin who asked whether this the idea of English being something that is causes people to be suspicious of for example, people like women, people like RuPaul's womanhood and wifehood, whether that would also apply to, for example, a woman who held a medical degree or who held or who was a lawyer. And I've just very quickly answered it in the chat, but I think I mean, I'm hesitant to say yes or no, because it very much depends on the particular context and the particular people that we're talking about. But I think yes, in the sense that anything which is associated with women's empowerment could be distrusted in certain spaces. But also at the same time, we also have to think about who are the types of women who become doctors and lawyers in India, who actually gets the chance to do that, because it's incredibly expensive to become, you have to have finished school and therefore not been asked to leave school early to support your family, but you have to then go on to pay for extremely costly higher education. So the chances are, if you are a woman who has become I mean, again, I am sort of generalizing here, but we look at general trends. If you're a woman who has become a doctor or a lawyer in India, it's likely that for a start, you went to English medium school, because a lot of this higher education is done in English, and you probably went to quite a good English medium school, therefore something which required quite a lot of money to pay for. So in those circles, English is probably going to be an expectation. I think the particular instance of RuPaul is what's interesting about RuPaul's sort of context is that she is specifically in this space where English is not an expectation, because her family didn't speak English. She's getting these marriage, she's involved in these marriage negotiations with families who don't often have a lot of English speakers in the family either. And so English is kind of being brought into the equation, and it's being negotiated, and people are wondering, what does this mean? What does this say about her? As opposed to somebody who became a doctor and has grown up speaking English. And therefore, if anything, them not speaking English would have been a real issue. So almost the opposite, but it was a great question. So thank you for that, Martin.
Thank you, Katie. So Eileen, everything okay now? I think what we can do would be just to share maybe bits and pieces.
Yeah.
Or you downloaded it? Yeah.
I downloaded it as a PDF. So
Okay,
I'll just
cross
share the
fingers,
PDF.
it works now.
I hope it works now. Okay. All right. So so this is the I think, okay, so I already talked about I think I'm on page 9 when I stopped. Okay, so I talked about the data, the academic, the different conversations, that I followed in the analysis. Okay, so now I will talk about the call center, okay, as a feminized, okay, workplace. And in this in this section, I'm mainly drawing on the early research, okay, on call centers. So the link between femininity and call center work is well established, with most studies reporting that about 60% to 70% of call center workers who engage in frontline customer service work in both the source countries and offshore locations are women. Okay, so this is data coming from the early 2000s, but still the same with actually there's still more women, okay, in the call centers, but also there's a slight change here, okay. In the Philippines today, current data show that of the 1.3 million people employed in the business process outsourcing industry, which is mostly concentrated on call center work, 53.2% are women, okay. So but it's not only that the call center is a feminized workplace, it's also discursively constructed, okay, as feminized. So for instance, feature articles for the call center industry, periodicals would typically use images of smiling women at their workstations, fingers typing away as they look and talk into their headsets. If you actually do a Google search, just input call centers or call center agents, these are the kinds of images that you will find. So one ubiquitous image that has since been recognizable as a symbol of offshore call center outsourcing is that of a young woman with a headset, a computer in front of her, and then a big smile on her face. Okay, so a few more images there. Apart, okay, from this discursive construction, there's also extensive research showing that the speech style, okay, that is required in call centers is also feminized. So Cameron notes that the style incorporates features of what has been characterized as women's language. And these include a friendly register, an expressive tone, use of feedback markers, and the smile, okay, in one's voice. So smiling, okay, is often culturally coded as feminine. Smiling translates into happy, friendly, positive voice. So operators, okay, are told to smile, even if obviously they do not see their interlocutors. They are invisible to their interlocutors, because the idea is that the callers will feel the smile, okay, in their voice. Okay. There's also expressive intonation, which refers largely to this tone of voice that evokes warmth, sincerity, excitement, friendliness, helpfulness, confidence. So like smiling, these characteristics are not inherently feminine, but they are culturally coded as such, especially when they are strongly effective. Okay. So taking all these features together, the style is meant to signal cooperation, establish rapport, and demonstrate other affective functions that form the cornerstones of quality customer service. Okay. Now, the question perhaps is, so what is problematic about that? Okay, if this is a feminized space, isn't it actually a good thing in the sense that, it's a place that hires women, okay, and therefore gives women, okay, a place to, work, earn money, better their lives, okay, but also the call center regime itself, okay, is a highly problematic, okay, space. So call center work is considered low skilled, it's routinized, it's repetitive work. Okay, some would actually liken it to, just simply answering the phone while following a script or a flow chart from which CSRs or agents cannot depart. It is also highly surveilled, rigidly monitored. It's emotional labor intensive, just like any kind of service work where service providers always have to please often irate customers and cannot talk back even if the customers are rude. It's also low paying with little to no room for promotion. Okay, so for instance, this is one way that it has been described. Call centers have been considered as work ghettos. Okay, and some of the critics of the call center industry have described it as a customer service factories, as sweatshops of the 21st century, and this might be a little extreme, but as dark satanic mills. Cameron herself calls call centers as communication factories because of the repetitive and rigid style that the industry requires. So viewed as work ghettos, call centers, okay, are deemed as a dead-end job that does not offer, that does not empower women or offer them agency. Okay, so that's in this body of work, as we have seen, gender is the main analytical, okay, category. Okay. Now, let's look at the offshore call center situation in the Philippines. There are, of course, still a lot of constraints, right? Because the call center regime carries its, structures of control, okay, and surveillance, and of course, its contradictory logics, okay, in the offshore locations. However, in the context of the Philippines, there's a at least some critics would say there's possibilities, okay, for agency in the sense that there is higher pay. The pay is still low compared to the rates in call centers in other countries, okay, or in the source countries, but compared to rates in other industries in the Philippines, it is considered high. There are also attractive benefits and perks. So there are incentives and bonuses. There's health insurance. There are a lot of social events. You have access to a gym. Also, there are better working conditions. So despite the graveyard shift, the building is, air conditioned. It's located in safe and reputable spaces. Also, a lot of professionalization trainings take place. So you have training workshops on the English language, on culture, use of technology. And there's also a more diverse group of call center workers, which then leads to a change in the gender makeup, of the workers. So this is particularly significant because this seems to be, a unique phenomenon in the Philippine offshore call centers. There are many gay men in the industries, in the industry rather, and the gay men are encouraged to cross-dress if they are so inclined. So there's also this conversation where the Philippine call center industry is being lauded as a safe space for LGBTQIA+ individuals, because they can work, and then still be true to who they really are. They do not need to hide. Okay, so one of my informants, Jean, says that there's a lot of gays in the call centers because they know how to project or act happy, even when they are already irate. They may be irate when the phone is on mute, but once they pick up, they have this perfectly professional voice with just the right touch of this "I'm willing to serve you" tone. So what seems to be happening is that terms like women and femininity are being deconstructed, and there is also an expansion on what these terms may mean. Also, the association between femininity and service work is being challenged in the sense that call center work is really about performing happiness, okay? Well, at least according to Jane. So the call centers may actually be considered a liberating, equalizing space in the context of the Philippines. But also I put a question mark there because this is something that will also be problematized later on. It might indeed be considered a liberating space because it allows, even encourages the workers to be who they are, okay, cross-dress, if they want to, which is not the case in many other perhaps more traditional industries in the Philippines. And the success of LGBTQIA+ call center workers in the industry may be considered as a case of linguistic agency that can then pave the way for transformative linguistic practices in the call centers. Also, there is the use of English, okay, and this has been considered a game changer. In the sense that the use of English professionalizes call center work. So in this particular extract from the interview, Karen talks about how it is important, okay, for the whole, English is such an important, okay, language, okay, for the whole call center industry because, of course, it's the medium that they use to talk to customers or partners. Also, the use of English gives prestige to the job. So if you here, another one of my informants, Wendy, talks about how in the call centers, in other places in the Philippines, right? You're not really required to speak in English, but in the call centers, of course, you have to because you are talking with American callers. So you're expected to have a good grasp of English. So much of the work on English and offshore call center research is focused on the misunderstandings that arise out of, cross-cultural communication between non-native English-speaking CSRs and the native English-speaking customers. Also, the organization of call center talk, the teaching of English in the call centers. There are some studies that look into the relationship between the use of English, globalization, and colonialism, but that's actually very few. From the list here, we can see that the preoccupation, okay, with English, okay, in the call centers is really geared towards teaching English, okay, so that, you know, more Filipinos, okay, will be able to join the call center workforce. So what has not been addressed, okay, by this body of work is how the use of English also functions as a gatekeeping mechanism that benefits certain groups of Filipino speakers of English while disenfranchising others. So the truth is only 3 to 4 out of 100 applicants make it in the industry due to the low level, okay, of English proficiency of many of these applicants. So the relatively high level of English proficiency required in the industry already serves as a gatekeeping practice that effectively discriminates against a large number of people who happen to be poor and from marginalized communities. One of my informants actually makes a case for the relationship between English and social class in the Philippines. So she says that you have to admit, really, the middle class ones, the well-off, they're the ones who actually get to watch cable. They're the ones who get to buy dictionaries and encyclopedias for their kids. The quality of education that they get, you know, everything just works for them. So, for example, if you didn't graduate from, these are actually exclusive private schools in the Philippines, it will be very difficult for you, okay, to, you know, be accepted into the call centers. So the ones, okay, who come from middle class backgrounds, they survive and thrive in the contact center industry because they grew up with computers, grew up with all of the cable channels available, and they are very comfortable with the language. That's an edge right there, okay? So this also needs to be seen within the broader, you know, a picture, okay, of the role of English in the Philippines. English remains a highly stratified along class lines. According to TUPAS, English in the Philippines is enmeshed in the politics of power and social stratification, which are both responsible for the distribution of wealth, of which language is a part in society, as well as the maintenance of the status quo. So one of my informants shared the story of Vash and his call center story. So he's gay, very eager. That should allow him to get into the industry, but he still failed because he was considered a lost cause during his training, because he could not differentiate between B and V, you know, these sounds. And so despite performing gayness, he failed to perform the right English. So the English requirement, okay, in the call center disrupts the language and gender connection, because speaking good English in the context of the Philippines is tied not only to gender, but also, and perhaps more significantly, to educational background and social class. So what we're seeing here is that the success of the LGBTQIA plus call center workers in the industry is in fact linked to social categories and processes other than gender and feminization, such as the use of English and the gatekeeping practice that this entails. So it curbs the possibility of the call center workplace as a truly transformative space. Okay. So the other critical point that the study foregrounds is that a singular analytical category like gender needs to be coupled with other analytical categories like class for the analysis to more fully accommodate and account for the complex and unequal social realities of language speakers. And also this demonstrates that what is happening on the ground is more intersectional than what is reflected in most dominant discourses, which means that that an intersectional approach is useful and necessary. So for some concluding thoughts, using Unequal Englishes as a framework highlights that the performance of English in the Philippine call centers is also a performance of a particular set of gendered and class identities that are placed along already existing hierarchies and inequalities, and also newly created ones, resulting from new systems and mechanisms of control in Philippine call centers. So unequal Englishes as a framework surfaces very real linguistic inequalities that are often sidelined or hidden because of its emphasis not just on language, but on the speakers who use the language. By situating language use in the world and in speakers, unequal Englishes makes it possible to tease out what language-only driven research is often unable to examine. Thank you. I guess that's that end of it. Okay, and here are my references too. Thank you so much. And I apologize again for that tech glitch.
It's all right. Thank you
Okay,
so much, Dr. Eileen. I
I'll
hope
share
you
it
can hear me
now.
well. Yep. Okay.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Great. So this is really a fascinating research. And we also apologize to the attendees because I think we might have to extend a little bit, maybe just 5 to 10 minutes extension because of the unfortunate and inevitable technical glitch, which is common in this kind of virtual space. So I'll just jump right into the questions that I sent to you, Eileen. So the first one has to do about what you mentioned about the possibilities of more transformative linguistic practices, right, in call centers as possibilities for linguistic agency. Could you share just a little bit more on what does this look like exactly? So if we link it to education, for example, how can teachers or educators help facilitate or move towards a greater awareness of such transformative linguistic practices?
Yeah, when I say transformative linguistic practices, I'm looking at those practices that recognize that language use and practice are never divorced from the social realities of speakers. So for instance, in the teaching of English in the classroom, what may perhaps be considered transformative is a practice that allows for the different ways that speakers use English on the assumption that people have unequal access to it, people need it in different ways, that the language functions differently for the students in the classroom, and this means really trying to teach the language with the knowledge of the social positions and the identity categories that students occupy, and whether students succeed or fail at what they are taught it really depends so much more on just the language, right? Okay, it actually depends on things outside of the classroom. So I think that's one way that I look at this transformative linguistic practices.
All right, thank you so much. I'm also very intrigued by what you mentioned about women's language in your presentation. So the way of constructing that so-called feminine persona. I was really fascinated by the smiling call center speech style, which apparently are elements that constitute what is deemed as quality customer service, right? So I'm also thinking in terms of what are the implications for this in terms of like educating strong-willed, decisive young women who may not necessarily fit this smiling mold or just basically refuse to adopt that kind of friendly, positive tone of the performative aspect of happiness. Should they just avoid customer service related professions altogether? And I was just thinking, maybe they can be taught to harness that power to enable them to lead in a non-threatening manner, not necessarily in a call center, workplace altogether. It could be in other disciplines, because that can constitute a different kind of power altogether as well, right? If they know how to harness that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so first, I think that they should not avoid, let's say, the service profession, right? Okay, and I think, in fact, maybe different kinds of personalities should, in fact, be allowed to and they should insist, to be allowed to work in these kinds of workspaces, largely because when you have a diversity of styles, it might actually lead to the delinking of, let's say, this smiling, friendly, okay, service-oriented like persona, and that this can actually just be done by women, right? Okay, that this automatically gets linked to femininity or to like that women are good at this. Okay. And I think that's really kind of the whole idea that this indexical, this indexicalities, okay, should actually be broadened, okay, such that, let's say, you don't necessarily have to be smiling all the time, or to be sweet to be able to perform service, right? Okay, so there's actually a possibility for a different kind of speech style. If, let's say, for instance, there are other personalities, okay, that may be allowed to thrive, okay, in service interactions, okay, or service, let's say, related contexts. But also, I think it's also possible to harness that, okay, if you are using it for a particular reason, or that you have a particular purpose, okay, for, let's say, trying to adapt this persona, or for trying to use this particular style, because it does wield power as well. There's actually a lot of discussion on this in language and gender research, where what's considered the feminized style, which is like powerless, right? Often thought of as powerless, or often thought of as weak, may actually be used in particular situations, in particular contexts, and it wields power. It is able to get the job done, okay? And there are studies that show that as well. For instance, in certain situations, women bosses, okay, or superiors may actually get work done faster, better, because of the speech style that they're using, right? Okay, it's more cooperative, it fosters solidarity. So in a lot of ways, it really depends on the context. And I think this is also what I'm trying to foreground in my presentation, that so much depends on the context. All of these things that apply to, like, the call centers in the UK and in the US, they do not apply anymore in the offshore call center situation, because so many things have changed, right? There are all this, of course, there's things that are the same, but there are also things that have changed. And so we have to take these things into account. For instance, in earlier call center work, there's no discussion at all of language use. It's just this feminized speech style. But in the Philippines, you have to take English into consideration, because it's such a big part, okay, of call center work in the Philippines. So if you ignore it, then it does not give you a complete picture of what's happening in, Philippine call centers. So I think that's kind of important, okay, that when we say, for instance, something is powerful, something is transformative, it will also really depend on the context, okay, where this thing is taking place, or where this thing is happening. So yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
I'm sure I'm not alone in really wanting to know more about this. And I think this is the perfect time to invite people and to inform people as well that we have a special issue coming up for the International Journal for Research and Education, which is housed within the College of Education. It's guest edited by Dr. Tupas. I think, Eileen, you're also a contributing author in that special issue, or in Dr. Tupas' edited book as well, right?
Yeah.
So we do have an opportunity to learn more once the special issue is published. And perhaps for the last 2 minutes, I could invite Dr. Katie and Dr. Tupas to join me. I think Saren has another meeting that she needs to jump into. So maybe Dr. Tupas, is there anything that you would like to add, or maybe just a comment or a question that you have before we adjourn?
Hi, Dr. Mara. Sorry, my video is not working at the moment.
It's okay.
Yeah, but I just would like to ask. I don't know, not a question, but I just would like to thank both Dr. Salonga and Dr. Hyatt for really brilliant presentations, and I think these are good beginnings of a series of also of other really great presentations. So thank you very much to both of you, and also to everybody who's around right now.
Thank you, Katie, for also staying on until quite late now. Any last words to share with our audience before we adjourn?
Just a big thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation. Thanks for the organization. I really enjoyed it. It's been nice to meet everyone, and yeah, keep in touch.
Thank you, Katie. Eileen, any last words?
Yes, just the same. Thank you to everyone. Thank you for sticking it out with me, and
Of course.
through that glitch. And this is a really wonderful, I think, a series. Again, I'm excited for the next
For the
talks.
upcoming ones,
Yeah.
yes. So
Thank
I
you.
believe that Najla and Fajr have been sharing the links to the feedback form, as well as the invitation for you to register for our upcoming session, I believe on the 19th of October, in 2 weeks' time.
The 13th of October.
The 13th of October. There you go. Thank you so much, Fajr. So, Fajr, I'll leave it to you now to thank everyone and to adjourn our session. Yep.
Thank you, Dr. Myra. And thank you, everybody, for listening. This has indeed been truly insightful. May I ask you to please fill out the feedback form for today's session shared earlier by my colleague Najla in the chat box. A special thank you goes to our speakers today. And with that, we conclude the first part of the symposium. I would like to bring to your attention that, like Dr. Myra has mentioned, session 2 of the symposium will be held on Thursday, October 13th. 2022. The registration link can be found in the chat box. Thank you so much, Najla, for co-hosting with me, and I look forward to seeing everybody then.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.